On the 28th of December 2025, Brigitte Bardot died. At La Madrague in Saint-Tropez, the silence felt heavier than any applause she had ever known. Headlines moved quickly, polished and familiar, calling her a legend, an icon, a symbol of freedom. Yet before accepting those words, a question demands to be asked. Who are we mourning, a woman, or an image the world consumed for decades? What happens when death arrives long after disappearance? When a person has already faded behind a mask called symbol, what does the final date truly mark? Bardot's body stopped, but her erasure had begun much earlier, slowly and publicly, under relentless admiration. Can fame kill without touching the body, without a diagnosis, without visible wounds? Do not begin with her beauty. Do not begin with childhood or stardom. Begin with contradiction. Bardot shook Europe in the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds. Yet, she never belonged to the machinery that desired her most. Hollywood wanted her, feared her, and failed to contain her. While the world insisted she remain illuminated, she searched for a place without spotlights, contracts, or applause. If fame is a reward, why did Bardot describe it as confinement? If she was adored, why did adoration feel indistinguishable from possession? Every photograph fixed her further in place. Every headline tightened the frame. Where does a human being go when every version of herself has already been decided? The 28th of December. 2025 is not a neat ending. It is a delayed punctuation mark. The story does not close with her death. It opens. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable thought. Perhaps Brigitte Bardot did not vanish because she was weak, but because survival required disappearance. And perhaps the real question is not why she left the stage, but why the world never learned how to let her live. Brigitte Bardot did not simply appear in European cinema during the 1,950 seconds. She disrupted it. In an era still bound by post-war morality and carefully managed femininity, Bardot's presence felt less like a debut and more like an intrusion. She was not introduced as a refined star or a polished ideal. She arrived as something raw, physical, and unsettling. The turning point came in 1956, with An God Created Woman. The film itself mattered, but the image mattered more. Bardot dancing barefoot, uncontained, unapologetic, did not merely suggest sexuality, it redefined how desire could exist on screen. This was not elegance. This was instinct. Not seduction performed for approval, but movement that seemed unaware of the audience watching. European cinema had never seen a woman behave like this without punishment or moral framing. At that moment, Bardot ceased to be just an actress. She became a cultural event, a body onto which anxieties about freedom, morality, and gender were projected. The shock was not that she was sensual, but that she appeared uncontrolled. That lack of control terrified some and fascinated millions. It was this contradiction, fear and desire, that elevated Bardot from performer to symbol. Hollywood noticed immediately, but Bardot was never its creation. Unlike the studio-manufactured icons of the American system, she emerged outside its rules. Hollywood wanted her image, but not her autonomy. It admired her appeal, while distrusting her refusal to be shaped. She did not fit the contracts, the discipline, or the narrative arcs Hollywood relied on to maintain order. As a result, Bardot became something rare, a global star who stood adjacent to Hollywood rather than inside it. This position made her powerful and dangerous. She represented freedom without explanation, sexuality without apology, a femininity that did not ask to be understood. Yet with that power came erasure. As Bardot's image spread, the person behind it began to disappear. The world responded not to her voice, her thoughts, or her boundaries, but to the silhouette it had already decided to keep. Who, then, created Brigitte Bardot, the woman herself, or the collective hunger of an audience unprepared for what it desired? And when a person becomes a symbol too quickly, how much of them is allowed to survive? From the very beginning, Bardot's historical role carried a cost. The same moment that made her unforgettable also marked the start of her disappearance. If Brigitte Bardot unsettled Europe, she actively disturbed Hollywood, not by attacking it, but by refusing to obey it. At a time when global stardom depended on contracts, discipline, and carefully managed public images, Bardot represented a problem the American system could not solve. She was desired, but not governable. Hollywood's interest in Bardot was immediate and intense. Studios saw her appeal, her marketability, her ability to ignite attention without translation. But what they encountered was not a malleable star in the making. Bardot showed little interest in long-term contracts, press choreography, or the ritual of selling a persona. She resisted the idea that fame required obedience. Where Hollywood expected gratitude, she offered distance. This resistance was not strategic rebellion, it was instinctive. Bardot did not see fame as a reward to be protected, but as a condition that demanded constant performance. Interviews felt invasive. Publicity felt artificial. The machinery surrounding celebrity, the rehearsed smiles, the polished anecdotes, the endless negotiation between truth and image felt like an enclosure. For Bardot, exposure did not equal power. It equaled loss of control. Hollywood, accustomed to shaping its stars, responded with ambivalence. It wanted Bardot's image without her unpredictability. It admired her freedom while fearing its implications. Unlike studio icons molded into stability, Bardot carried volatility. She could not be reliably framed as wholesome, tragic, or aspirational. She refused to soften her edges to maintain acceptance. This refusal placed her outside the traditional hierarchy of stardom. As a result, Bardot's relationship with Hollywood remained incomplete. She did not build a sustained American career, not because of rejection, but because of incompatibility. She did not want to belong to a system that demanded she become manageable. Her fame expanded globally, yet she stood apart from the structures meant to preserve it. This distance became part of her mythology, a star who never fully surrendered. But this separation came at a cost. Without the protective narratives Hollywood often provides comebacks, reinventions, controlled scandals, Bardot was left exposed. Fame followed her without offering refuge. She was visible everywhere, yet supported nowhere. The world consumed her image, while denying her the stability that images are meant to secure. Was fame supposed to be a privilege or a transaction? And if Bardot refused the terms, was withdrawal the only remaining option? By rejecting Hollywood's model, she preserved her autonomy but also isolated herself from the structures that soften public judgment. From early on, Bardot understood something many stars realized too late. Fame does not liberate by default. Without surrender, it confines. For Brigitte Bardot, public fascination did not stop at the edge of the screen. It followed her into her most private spaces, reshaping intimacy into performance and emotion into spectacle. What appeared, from the outside, as a life surrounded by desire was experienced from within as continuous psychological pressure. Bardot's personal relationships were intense, unstable, and frequently short-lived. Marriages ended. Love affairs collapsed under scrutiny. These patterns were often dismissed as excess or temperament, but the deeper cause was structural. It is difficult to sustain closeness when privacy no longer exists. Affection, jealousy, conflict, none of it unfolded in silence. Everything became material for public interpretation, commentary, and judgment. During the height of her fame, Bardot lived with persistent depression. This was not an abstract sadness, but a prolonged condition shaped by exhaustion and confinement. She was expected to remain luminous, available, and emotionally intact at all times. Any sign of fragility threatened the image others relied on. The result was a widening gap between what she was required to project and what she was able to endure. At several moments early in her life, Bardot reached points of profound psychological crisis episodes in which continuing forward no longer felt possible. These were not theatrical gestures or publicity-driven breakdowns. They were signals of a mind overwhelmed by the loss of control over its own existence. Yet even these moments were filtered through a lens of disbelief. How could someone so admired be so desperate to escape? Sexualization intensified this fracture. Bardot was not only admired, she was continuously reduced to her physical presence. Her body became a site of projection, endlessly photographed and interpreted. Over time, this attention stripped her of authorship. Her thoughts mattered less than her silhouette. Her voice was quieter than the image attached to her name. To be seen everywhere, yet not truly heard, produced a deep sense of alienation. As fame expanded, Bardot's sense of self contracted. The boundaries that protect inner life dissolved. Emotions were no longer private experiences, but public currency. She described feeling owned, watched, and cornered, unable to step outside the role assigned to her. Psychological distress, in this context, was not an anomaly. It was an inevitable response. What happens when admiration becomes suffocating? When visibility eliminates refuge? Bardot's crisis was not a failure of character. It was the consequence of living as a permanent object of desire. By the time she began to withdraw, the damage was already internalized. The struggle did not announce itself loudly, it accumulated silently, until disappearance began to feel like the only remaining form of relief. In 1973, at the age of 39, Brigitte Bardot walked away from cinema while still at the height of global recognition. There was no scandal forcing her exit, no creative collapse, no public failure to explain it away. The decision unsettled audiences precisely because it violated the expected arc of stardom. Icons were meant to fade slowly, to return for tributes, to be gently escorted off stage. Bardot chose none of that. Her retirement was immediate and uncompromising. She did not frame it as a pause or a transition. She did not hint at future projects. She did not leave the door open. In an industry built on the promise of return, Bardot closed the door herself. This refusal to linger confused critics and frustrated admirers. Why leave when the spotlight still burns so brightly? Why abandon the very thing others spend their lives chasing? The answer was not rejection of work, but rejection of condition. For Bardot, cinema had become inseparable from exposure. Acting was no longer a craft she could enter and exit. It had merged with the constant demand to be seen. Each role reinforced the same image. Each appearance tightened the same frame. Continuing meant accepting a future in which the symbol would permanently outrun the person. Retirement then was not a retreat into obscurity. It was an act of preservation. By stepping away, Bardot attempted to reclaim a boundary that fame had erased. She chose absence over endurance, silence over repetition. The world interpreted this as abandonment of fans, of art, of legacy. But from her perspective, it was survival. Remaining visible would have required the ongoing sacrifice of a self already worn thin. There would be no return tours, no anniversary performances, no curated nostalgia. Bardot refused the rituals that allow public figures to re-enter the spotlight on safer terms. Even when admiration softened with time, she did not leverage it for comfort. Her disappearance was not strategic, it was consistent. Each year of silence reinforced the original decision. This choice carried consequences. Without the controlled narratives that comebacks provide, Bardot ceded control of her story to memory and speculation. She forfeited the chance to redefine herself publicly. But she also escaped the cycle of reconsumption. The industry could no longer demand availability. The audience could no longer expect access. Why is leaving at the peak considered more troubling than collapsing at the bottom? Why does endurance earn praise while refusal provokes suspicion? Bardot's disappearance challenged the core assumption of celebrity culture, that visibility is an obligation. By stepping away without explanation, she reframed retirement not as defeat, but as an assertion of agency. In choosing to vanish while still desired, Bardot rejected the idea that a life must be performed to remain valid. The stage did not expel her. She left it deliberately, finally, and without apology. As time passed, Brigitte Bardot became increasingly absent from public life, not as a statement, but as a necessity. Aging did not arrive quietly. Her physical strength diminished, mobility became limited, and pain grew more frequent. Periods of medical treatment and hospitalization marked the later decades of her life, though details remained largely private. There was no single diagnosis presented for public consumption. Bardot did not frame her condition through medical language, nor did she invite sympathy by narrating decline. Instead, she withdrew further from view. The body that had once been endlessly photographed, analyzed, and desired was no longer available. Silence replaced explanation. This physical weakening did not exist in isolation. It unfolded after years of sustained psychological strain. Long-term depression, exhaustion, and emotional pressure leave traces that are not always visible but are deeply felt. When this stress persists without relief, the body often absorbs the burden. Fatigue becomes constant. Pain loses a clear origin. Recovery slows. In Bardot's case, the line between emotional wear and physical decline gradually disappeared. Isolation intensified this process. After retirement, her world contracted sharply. Human contact became selective and limited. Saint-Tropez, long associated with glamour and spectacle, functioned instead as containment. The reduction of external stimuli offered protection, but it also reinforced solitude. Without the distractions of public life, physical discomfort had fewer places to hide. The contrast was unavoidable. A body once celebrated for movement and sensuality now struggled with basic function. The world that had once demanded her constant visibility no longer demanded anything at all. Yet, absence did not automatically bring peace. Decline carries its own weight, particularly when experienced without witnesses. Bardot did not seek pity. She did not explain herself. She allowed the body to speak only through withdrawal. Was this simply the natural progression of age, or the accumulated cost of decades lived under relentless exposure? Can a body remember what it has endured long after the spotlight fades? And when visibility finally ends, does the body rest, or does it reveal what endurance has concealed? By refusing to name her condition, Bardot avoided one final transformation, becoming defined by illness. She did not want decline to replace desire as the lens through which she was seen. This restraint was consistent with her earlier refusals. Just as she rejected fame's ownership, she rejected deterioration as spectacle. Her physical decline marked another quiet disappearance, not dramatic, not public, but decisive. It underscored a reality often ignored in stories of celebrity. Survival leaves marks. The body keeps record when narratives move on. And in Bardot's case, the slow retreat of the body echoed a life spent trying to escape a world that never learned how to look without taking. After leaving cinema and retreating from public life, Brigitte Bardot did not seek comfort in nostalgia or reinvention. Instead, she redirected her remaining energy toward animals. This was not a symbolic gesture or a late-life hobby. It became the defining structure of her later years. The shift reflected exhaustion rather than idealism. Human relationships had grown inseparable from judgment, intrusion, and distortion. Words were misread. Intentions were questioned. Every appearance carried consequences. Animals offered something radically different: presence without demand. They did not watch her. They did not interpret her past. They did not require explanation or performance. Bardot dedicated the second half of her life to animal protection with consistency and intensity. Advocacy replaced visibility. Routine replaced spectacle. The work was often repetitive, unglamorous, and emotionally heavy, yet it offered clarity. In this space, she was not a symbol of desire or rebellion. She was simply responsible. The absence of an audience mattered more than recognition. Animals came to represent what had been missing from her experience with people: silence, lack of judgment, and the absence of possession. They did not claim her image or demand coherence. Caring for them did not erase contradiction, but it allowed her to exist without constant negotiation of identity. This was not redemption, nor an attempt to soften her legacy. It was alignment with a world that did not consume her. Her life became increasingly closed. Saint-Tropez functioned not as a retreat of luxury, but as containment. Social contact narrowed. Daily routines followed strict boundaries. This withdrawal was often interpreted as bitterness or hostility toward humanity. But distance, for Bardot, was functional. It reduced exposure. It preserved energy. It prevented further harm. Was this a rejection of people, or a response to decades of being claimed by them? The distinction is blurred. What matters is that this turn created stability where none had existed before. Critics labeled the commitment excessive or extreme, but the intensity mirrored the way fame had once overtaken her life. The difference was consent. This time, she chose the terms. This phase did not restore peace in any sentimental sense. It did not resolve old wounds or contradictions, but it allowed survival without spectacle. After years of being defined through others' projections, Bardot constructed a world small enough to control. The turn away from humanity was not a declaration of hatred. It was a boundary drawn late, deliberately, and without apology. On the 28th of December 2025, Brigitte Bardot died at La Madrague in Saint-Tropez. The reaction was immediate and familiar. Headlines softened her image. Tributes emphasized beauty, freedom, and legend. The language of farewell tried to smooth decades of tension into something resolved. For a moment, it seemed as if death might finally close the argument. It did not. Almost as quickly as the praise arrived, the unresolved fractures returned. Old controversies resurfaced. Public figures hesitated, edited, or withdrew their tributes. Commentaries split along the same lines that had followed Bardot for years. Her passing did not unify opinion. It exposed how divided it had always been. The world struggled with a familiar discomfort. How to honor a cultural icon who never made peace with being one. This was not accidental. Bardot never attempted a final reconciliation with the public. There was no late-life reframing, no apology tour, no effort to make her legacy easier to digest. She did not correct the record for comfort's sake. She did not adjust herself to fit a version history might prefer. Instead, she allowed contradiction to remain unresolved, even at the cost of affection. That choice defines the final shape of her legacy. Bardot is remembered simultaneously as a symbol of liberation and as a deeply polarizing figure. As someone who altered how desire could be represented, and as someone whose views alienated many, these identities coexist without cancellation or synthesis. Death did not reconcile them because reconciliation was never offered. The cost of this refusal was high. Bardot spent much of her later life isolated, misunderstood, and often disliked. She accepted that price. Freedom, for her, was never synonymous with approval. To be unowned by systems, movements, or audiences meant relinquishing the comfort of consensus. What remained was autonomy imperfect, lonely, and intact. Why does the death of some icons bring closure, while others leave tension behind? Perhaps because Bardot never allowed herself to be simplified. She resisted final definitions while alive, and she resists them still. Her story refuses a moral conclusion. It offers no lesson neatly wrapped for admiration or condemnation. In the end, Bardot's legacy is not a story of downfall or redemption. It is the record of a woman who recognized the cost of being consumed and chose withdrawal over compliance. She was loved, resented, idealized, and rejected often simultaneously, and she accepted that reality without attempting to correct it. Her death did not soften her contradictions, it confirmed them. The final cost of her freedom was not obscurity, but permanent ambiguity. Brigitte Bardot left behind no comfortable ending, only a question that remains unresolved. What does it truly mean to live freely, when freedom itself guarantees misunderstanding? There is no final lesson to extract from Brigitte Bardot's life. No balanced verdict that reconciles admiration with discomfort. Her story resists closure because she resisted ownership by Hollywood, by movements, by public forgiveness. What remains is not harmony, but tension held in place. Perhaps that is the truest legacy she leaves behind. Proof that freedom, when pursued without compromise, does not promise peace. It promises consequence. Bardot understood that bargain early, paid it fully, and refused to renegotiate at the end. If this story made you uncomfortable, reflective, or forced you to reconsider what fame really costs, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you see Brigitte Bardot as a symbol of liberation, a victim of celebrity culture, or something far more complicated? If you value stories that look beyond nostalgia and refuse easy answers, consider liking this video and subscribing. Your engagement helps us continue exploring the lives behind the legends, not to judge them, but to understand what history often chooses to simplify.